A four-door family sedan. Drum brakes in the back. A bench seat wide enough for three. The kind of car your grandfather might have driven to church on Sunday morning. And a top speed that no police car in America could beat for the next 37 years. Let that sit with you for a second. Not 5 years. Not 10. 30. 7 years. This is legacy engines, and I spend way too much time thinking about forgotten automotive records and the machines that set them. If you're someone who loves digging into the history behind iconic cars, the engineering decisions that defined eras, and the stories that the mainstream automotive world somehow forgot to tell, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, here's the thing. When most people talk about the fastest police cars in American history, they picture something obvious. Maybe a modern Dodge Charger Pursuit screaming down a desert highway. Maybe the classic Crown Victoria, the black and white workhorse of 100 Hollywood car chases. Maybe, if they're really into it, they'll bring up the Ford Mustang Special Service Package from the early 1980s, which we are absolutely going to talk about today because that story is wild. But almost nobody brings up a 1969 Dodge Polara. A full-size, body-on-frame, fleet-spec family sedan that Chrysler built for police agencies across the country. A car that, on paper, was supposed to be sensible, forgettable, practical, the automotive equivalent of a stapler. Nobody was supposed to remember the 1969 Dodge Polara. Nobody was supposed to write about it, argue about it, or make a video about it 55 years later. Instead, it set a top speed record that outlived the muscle car era, survived the oil crises, outlasted disco, survived the Reagan years, survived the Clinton years, and stood completely untouched deep into the 21st century. A record set in 1969 didn't fall until 2006, 37 years later. So today we are going to answer 3 questions. How did one plain-looking four-door sedan become the fastest police car in America? Why did American police cars get dramatically slower for the next 4 decades? And what finally took the crown back? Because the answer to that last question is, almost poetically perfect, and we're going to get there. But to understand any of this, we have to start not with the car itself, but with the test. The brutal, unforgiving, almost sadistic test that forced it into existence. In the late 1960s, if you wanted to sell a police car to the California Highway Patrol, you did not mail them a brochure. You did not take their fleet manager to lunch. You did not show them a PowerPoint presentation, which, granted, hadn't been invented yet, but the point stands. You had to pass a test. And the California Highway Patrol's pursuit car specification was, to put it mildly, not messing around. By 1968, the CHP's requirements read less like a fleet purchase order and more like a dare written by someone who genuinely wanted to watch automakers suffer. First, the engine had to displace at least 420 cubic inches. Small blocks need not apply. It had to run knock-free on 100-octane fuel, breathing through a single 4-barrel carburetor. From a standing start, the car had to reach 115 miles per hour by the end of 1 mile and 125 miles per hour by the end of 2 miles. And then there were the brakes. The car had to execute 4 hard stops from 90 miles per hour down to 0, right at the threshold of lockup, with only 2 minutes of recovery time between each stop. Then, after all 4 of those stops, a final panic stop from 60 miles per hour. And after all of that abuse, the brakes still could not fade. They could not drag. They had to perform as if nothing had happened. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's demanding, but these are police cars. Shouldn't they be good? And yes, absolutely. But here's what most people don't realize. This was 1968. The technology gap between what the CHP was demanding and what most American automakers were building for fleet sales was enormous. Agencies across the country were still ordering warmed-over standard sedans with mild police packages. The CHP, which was patrolling some of the longest, hottest, fastest stretches of highway in the country, had essentially decided that wasn't good enough anymore. So they wrote a specification that would force excellence, or eliminate contenders entirely. Most cars that entered testing couldn't do it. The specification was that specific, that punishing, and that uncompromising. But in 1969, one car didn't just squeak through. One car met that specification so completely, so convincingly, that it didn't just pass. It set a benchmark that an entire industry would spend the next 4 decades trying to match. That car was the 1969 Dodge Polara Pursuit. And before we talk about what it did, let's talk about what it looked like, because the contrast matters. On paper and on the street, the Polara was nobody's idea of a legend. It wore Chrysler's new fuselage styling for 1969, which sounds impressive until you realize fuselage styling basically meant the body was shaped like, well, a very smooth, very large, very heavy box. Slab sides everywhere. A wide, flat hood. The visual appeal of a well-maintained refrigerator. It was a full-size, body-on-frame automobile tipping the scales at well over 2 tons. It had a bench seat in the front. It had drum brakes on the rear axle. It looked like every other unloved fleet sedan in every government parking lot in America. And then you looked under the hood. Sitting in the engine bay of the Pursuit version was Chrysler's 440 cubic inch Magnum V8. 375 horsepower. And here's the number that actually mattered for police work. Nearly 480 pound-feet of torque. Paired to Chrysler's legendary TorqueFlite 3-speed automatic transmission and tuned with highway-friendly rear axle gearing, this was a drivetrain built not for drag strip glory but for sustained, relentless, high-speed performance. The kind of performance that keeps working after you've already been running for 5 minutes at triple-digit speeds. At Chrysler's Chelsea Proving Grounds in Michigan, on the banked high-speed oval, that heavy 4-door sedan ran 147 miles per hour. Some accounts say it brushed 150. Let that number sit in your brain for a moment. 147 miles per hour. In a 4-door police sedan. In 1969. With drum brakes in the back and a bench seat wide enough for 3 grown adults. 0 to 60 came up in roughly 6.5 seconds. The quarter-mile fell in the low 14-second range. That was genuine muscle car territory. That was numbers that contemporary Mustangs and Camaros were chasing, wrapped in a package that could carry 2 officers, their equipment, and a prisoner. According to period testing reported by automotive journalists covering the police vehicle market at the time, and later documented extensively by researchers like Sergeant Randy Sutton and writers covering the California Highway Patrol's procurement history, the Polara's performance figures were not just the best in the police car market. They were in a category by themselves. Here's what made the 440 Polara so effective in the real world, though, and this is the part that the officers who drove them still talk about with a kind of reverence. It wasn't that it was quick off the line. It wasn't, necessarily. A sports car with a lighter footprint could jump away from a stoplight faster. The Polara's superpower was the mid-range. That massive torque curve meant the engine was still pulling hard, still surging forward with authority, at speeds where lighter, higher revving engines were already running out of breath. You could beat a 440 Polara off the line. Plenty of cars could. But once that big Dodge was rolling, once you hit 70, 80, 90 miles per hour and the torque was fully on song, the gap between the patrol car and the getaway car started closing. And closing. And closing. You could outlaunch a 440 Polara. You could not outrun one. This is where it gets really interesting, because the California Highway Patrol didn't just buy these cars off a standard order form. They were, along with the Los Angeles Police Department, such a critical customer for Chrysler that the manufacturer built specific components exclusively for their pursuit vehicles. Specific parts that you could not order as a civilian. The CHP even specified its own camshaft grind, a particular profile engineered to optimize that 440 for sustained high-speed operation rather than peak dyno numbers. And here is the detail that tells you everything you need to know about the era, the thinking, and the people involved. To save money on the purchase price, the California Highway Patrol ordered many of their Polaras without power steering. Even though the car was designed for it. Even though that big V8 nose was heavy enough to make parking lot maneuvers a genuine physical event. Patrolmen muscling that massive front end through a mountain canyon corner at pursuit speeds were getting a real workout. And they did it willingly because the car underneath them was worth it. The CHP paid approximately $2,300 per car, significantly below the civilian sticker price. And even at that fleet discount price point, the cars still came standard with air conditioning, because the agency was smart enough to know that an officer baking in a pursuit vehicle during a California August wasn't going to be performing at his best when the car finally came to a stop. Now, 37 years. That's a number I keep coming back to, because I want to make sure we fully appreciate what that means in context. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics CPI inflation calculator and automotive market research from organizations like the Motor Vehicle Research Institute, the American automobile went through more significant engineering change between 1969 and 2006 than in virtually any comparable 37-year window in the industry's history. Fuel injection replaced carburetors. Computers entered the engine management equation. Aerodynamic understanding improved dramatically. Tire technology advanced by leap. Suspension design was revolutionized. Materials science introduced new options for weight reduction. Braking technology transformed completely. And through all of it, not one four-door police car went faster than a heavy, carbureted, drum-braked 1969 Dodge with a bench seat. Look, I want to be precise here, because a record like this deserves precision. The 147 mph figure comes from Chrysler's own Chelsea Proving Grounds testing, which was the standard benchmark used by police agencies evaluating vehicles. The Michigan State Police, who began conducting their now famous annual vehicle tests in the early 1970s, became the independent gold standard for police car evaluation. And their testing, year after year, decade after decade, could not produce a four-door police sedan that matched what Chrysler had done in 1969. We'll come back to exactly when and how the record finally fell, because the story of that moment is worth savoring. But for now, hold on to 147. Because the next thing you need to understand is what happened to that number almost immediately after it was set. The fastest police car in America was not beaten by a competitor. Nobody built something quicker and knocked it off its throne in a fair fight. Instead, it was strangled. Slowly, methodically, almost bureaucratically, a few horsepower at a time, by forces that no pursuit driver could outrun and no engineer at Chrysler could completely overcome. Watch what happened to the 440 itself. In 1969, it made 375 horsepower and ran 147 miles per hour. In 1970, to begin meeting new federal emissions standards, compression ratios were reduced. The Polara Pursuit's top speed fell to approximately 141 miles per hour. In 1971, the power rating slid to 370 horsepower. By 1972, with compression squeezed down further and exhaust systems modified for emissions compliance, that once magnificent 440 had collapsed to 285 horsepower in net rating terms. Same basic engine. Same block. Same fundamental architecture. In 3 model years, the Pursuit specification had effectively lost nearly 100 horsepower. The king was dying by inches. 3 forces were doing the killing simultaneously. The first was emissions regulation. The Clean Air Act of 1970 and its subsequent amendments required automakers to dramatically reduce hydrocarbon and nitrogen oxide emissions from their vehicles. The engineering solutions of the era, reduced compression, exhaust gas recirculation, catalytic converters, early fuel systems that weren't yet optimized, all of them came at a direct cost to power output and high-speed performance. It was not incompetence. It was physics. You cannot dramatically lower compression ratios, introduce significant exhaust flow restrictions, and retard ignition timing without losing horsepower. The laws of thermodynamics do not bend for fleet purchasers or highway patrol agencies. The second force was fuel. The 1973 OPEC oil embargo sent gasoline prices up roughly 40% almost overnight, according to U.S. Energy Information Administration historical data. The 1979 Iranian Revolution triggered a second crisis. Agencies that had been happily ordering 440 cubic-inch police cars suddenly had budget directors asking very pointed questions about fuel consumption. A police car that got 8 miles per gallon in city driving was a very different proposition at 55 cents per gallon than it was at 35. The pressure to downsize engines was not just regulatory. It was financial. The third force was the cars themselves getting physically smaller. To meet federal fuel economy standards, particularly the corporate average fuel economy regulations introduced in 1975, automakers began dramatically downsizing their full-size platforms. The big, body-on-frame behemoths that had given the 440 its natural habitat were shrinking. By 1978, the standard police Dodge had dropped from the big B-body full-size platform down to a smaller, lighter, but significantly less powerful midsize chassis. Officers who worked through this transition period will describe it with a particular kind of frustration. The cars just got slower, they'll tell you. Every year, you got in the seat and something that used to happen automatically, that surge of power when you needed it, was a little less certain, a little less forceful, a little less there. The machine was dying underneath them, incrementally, year by year, and there was almost nothing anyone behind the wheel could do about it. And here is the strange television footnote to all of this, because history sometimes has a sense of humor. That downsized, mid-size Dodge that became the symbol of the shrinking era, the car that represented the industry's retreat from the performance standards of 1969, would soon become famous on television as the police car that could never quite catch the Duke boys in the Dukes of Hazzard. Every week, millions of Americans watched law enforcement in a medium-sized Dodge fail spectacularly at high-speed pursuit. The metaphor was almost too perfect. By then, catching anything with genuine power had become genuinely difficult. In 1978, the Michigan State Police ran their annual independent vehicle evaluation, and the winner, the fastest, most capable police car in the country that model year, was a 440 Plymouth Fury that topped out at approximately 133 miles per hour in testing. 133. And remember, that was the winner. The best car in America's police fleet, the car that won the evaluation outright, was running 14 miles per hour slower than the Polara had run 9 years earlier. To frame that differently, by some accounts, an ordinary civilian full-size sedan of the same era could approach similar numbers under the right conditions. The Pursuit car had surrendered its edge almost entirely. After 1978, the big block era in law enforcement was finished. The 440 was gone. The largest engines available in pursuit-rated police vehicles dropped dramatically to 351 cubic inches, to 360, options that would have seemed impossibly small to the engineers who had written the California Highway Patrol's 1968 specification. For the first time in the modern era of American law enforcement, criminals driving ordinary sports cars had a realistic chance of simply pointing their vehicle down a highway and driving away from police pursuit. Not because they were clever. Not because they had a particularly special car. Just because the math now worked in their favor. Something had to change. And when the change came, it arrived from the most unexpected direction imaginable. By the early 1980s, the California Highway Patrol had arrived at a point of genuine institutional crisis regarding their vehicles. The big blocks were gone. The full-size Fords they were running, the early ancestors of what would become the Crown Victoria, were reliable and roomy and comfortable, all the things a patrol car needs to be during a long shift. But they were heavy and aerodynamically challenged, and simply not fast enough for sustained high-speed pursuit on California's wide-open interstates and desert highways. On those roads, with their long sight lines and their potential for extreme speeds, an underpowered patrol car wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a public safety problem. So the CHP went looking for something radically different. Small, light, fast. The obvious answer, the one that anyone familiar with the American performance car market at the time would have immediately suggested, was a Chevrolet Camaro. Specifically the Z28, which was light, which was quick, which looked aggressive and purposeful and everything a pursuit car was supposed to look like. The CHP thought so too. They took a Z28 and put it through an intensive evaluation. 18 months of real-world patrol use and performance testing. At the end of those 18 months, the CHP said no. The Camaro had revealed reliability issues under sustained pursuit conditions, specifically involving main bearing caps and camshaft components that simply could not stand up to the kind of abuse a genuine pursuit vehicle experiences regularly. A patrol car isn't a sports car that occasionally gets pushed hard. It's a machine that gets pushed hard as a routine part of its job, and it has to survive that abuse every single time. The Z28, for all its appeal, couldn't make that promise. So in 1981, the California Highway Patrol put out a competitive bid. Chevrolet returned with the Camaro, apparently believing the problems could be addressed. And Ford came back with something that virtually nobody saw coming. A Mustang. Not an exotic, not a specially developed racing derivative, not a prototype. A production Mustang. A stripped notchback coupe riding the lightweight Fox platform, powered by a 302 cubic inch V8, wearing basic police equipment. Ford's bid came in at approximately $6,800 per car. Chevrolet's Camaro bid was over $11,000. The Mustang was faster where the testing measured speed, significantly more reliable under sustained performance conditions, and cheaper by a margin that made the decision almost embarrassingly simple. Ford won the contract, and it wasn't particularly close. In 1982, the California Highway Patrol took delivery of approximately 400 Ford Mustang Special Service Package vehicles, the SSP, and on California's highways, the effect was immediate and unmistakable. The 5-liter V8 in that lightweight Fox body produced a combination of acceleration and top speed that pursuit drivers hadn't experienced in years. The SSP came with a speedometer certified to 140 miles per hour. Later versions, after 1989, carried certification all the way to 160 miles per hour. There is a story about the Ford Mustang SSP era that floats around among retired CHP officers and automotive historians, and it is almost certainly at least partially true in spirit even where the specific details may be embellished. The story goes that a driver, after being pulled over by a Mustang patrol car following a sustained high-speed chase, told the trooper something along the lines of knowing he could outrun those other patrol cars, but knowing he couldn't outrun a Mustang. We do know for certain that in early 1986, a Utah Highway Patrol trooper in an SSP pursued a fleeing motorcycle at verified speeds reaching 130 miles per hour. The little Mustang held on. But here is the genuinely funny limitation of the Mustang era, and it speaks to the fundamental tension in police vehicle design that has always existed between performance and practicality. The Mustang was a 2-seat pony car. The back seat, to the extent it existed at all in the SSP configuration, was not designed to transport human beings in any practical sense, which meant the Mustang could chase a suspect, catch a suspect, and pull a suspect over. And then it had to wait. It had to call for a 4-door unit to come and actually transport the person to jail. The fastest car in the fleet couldn't complete the fundamental task by itself. It could catch anything on the road. It just couldn't keep it once caught. And this gets at something important about what a police car actually has to be. It's not just a performance vehicle. It's a mobile office, a transport unit, an emergency response vehicle, a command post, and yes, a pursuit car, all in one package. The Mustang SSP solved the speed problem brilliantly while essentially ignoring several other parts of that equation. Which is why it was never the only answer, and why the industry kept searching for something that could do everything. That gap began closing in 1994 when Chevrolet did something genuinely audacious. They took the LT1 V8 from the Corvette, a 260 horsepower fuel-injected modern engine, and they dropped it into the big four-door Caprice. For the first time in a long time, police had access to a vehicle that could run down suspects at genuinely high speeds and had room for 2 officers, equipment, and a prisoner in the back seat. The 1994 Caprice 9C1 won the Michigan State Police evaluation outright that year, posting the best acceleration numbers the tests had seen in years. Chevrolet claimed at the time, based on their own proving grounds testing, that the 1994 Caprice had broken the Polara's 37-year-old speed record. And here is where you need to pay very close attention, because this is where the story gets precise in a way that actually matters. When the Michigan State Police ran their independent evaluation of that same 1994 Caprice 9C1, the car posted a top speed of 135 miles per hour. 135. Not 147. Not 150. 135 miles per hour. The 1994 Caprice was a superb police car. It dominated its evaluation year. It was a genuine step forward in law enforcement vehicle capability. It won. And it was still running 12 miles per hour slower than a 1969 Dodge Polara. The old record still stood. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but modern cars have to be safer, cleaner, more fuel efficient. They're carrying computers, heavy equipment, armor plating, all of that adds weight and drag. And yes, that's true. But it doesn't fully explain a 37-year gap, because here's what most people don't realize. The engineering talent available to automakers in 1990 or 1995 was dramatically more sophisticated than anything Chrysler had in 1969. Modern aerodynamics, modern engine management, modern materials science, all of it was available and improving every year. The issue wasn't that building a 147+ mile-per-hour four-door police sedan was technologically impossible after 1969. The issue was that nobody had committed to doing it within the specific constraints of police vehicle packaging, durability requirements, and fleet pricing until the market finally demanded it. Through the entire 1990s, the record held. The Polara remained, statistically, the fastest four-door police car ever tested in America. A car built in the Johnson administration, with a carburetor, with drum brakes on the rear axle, with no electronic engine management of any kind, with gross rated horsepower figures that regulators would never allow to be published the same way again. That car continued to hold its title into the era of GPS navigation, into the era of ABS brakes, into the era of digital engine control units and variable valve timing and traction control systems that simply didn't exist when it was built. And then, 2006. Here's where the story closes in the most satisfying way possible, and I want you to appreciate the symmetry of this before I tell you the number. The record was set by a Dodge, a Chrysler product, a car wearing the Ram's head badge, built on a full-size American rear-wheel drive platform, powered by a big displacement American V8. After 37 years, the car that finally broke the record was a Dodge, a Chrysler product, built on a full-size American rear-wheel drive platform, powered by a big displacement American V8. The 2006 Dodge Charger Pursuit, equipped with the 5.7-liter Hemi V8, producing 340 horsepower in its police specification, went through Michigan State Police independent testing and posted a verified top speed of 150 miles per hour. 150. The Polara's record, that 147-mile-per-hour benchmark that had defined and shamed an entire industry for nearly 4 decades, was finally broken. and it was broken by the Polara's own spiritual descendant, carrying the same brand name, the same general philosophy of a big engine in a rear-wheel drive American sedan, updated for the 21st century with fuel injection and modern electronics and dramatically improved aerodynamics, but philosophically the same animal that Chrysler had unleashed on the Chelsea banking in 1969. The engineers who designed the 2006 Charger Pursuit knew what they were chasing. Chrysler's own historical records documented the Polara's achievement, and the Michigan State Police Testing Archive, one of the most comprehensive collections of law enforcement vehicle performance data in existence, had that 147 number sitting in its files every single year as the benchmark that modern engineering kept failing to clear. When the Charger finally ran 150, it wasn't just a new police car winning an evaluation. It was the closure of a 37-year question. So what does all of this mean? Look, here's the thing. The 1969 Dodge Polara's record isn't just a cool automotive trivia fact, though it absolutely is that. It's a window into something much more significant about how technology, regulation, economics, and institutional priorities interact in ways that produce genuinely counterintuitive outcomes. In the conventional story of automotive progress, newer is always faster. More sophisticated is always better. The march of technology is linear and upward. Later cars are always more capable than earlier ones. The Polara destroys that narrative completely. Here is the real lesson embedded in those 37 years. Performance is not just about technology. Performance is about what you are allowed to optimize for, what you are willing to spend, and what trade-offs you are prepared to accept. In 1969, Chrysler was allowed to build a 440 cubic inch engine with a compression ratio of 10.1 to 1 running on premium fuel with no catalytic converter and no meaningful emissions restrictions. They were selling to an agency willing to pay a premium for performance and willing to skip power steering to save money. The optimization target was brutally simple: go as fast as possible while surviving the CHP's brutality tests. Everything else was secondary. Under those conditions, with that mandate and those freedoms, Chrysler built something that the entire industry spent nearly 4 decades unable to match under the different conditions that followed. The malaise era, the emissions mandates, the fuel crises, the downsizing pressure, none of those things represented engineering failure. They represented a different set of priorities overwhelming the performance priority. And when those different priorities began to gradually relax, when fuel injection and computer management allowed engineers to recover power while still meeting emissions standards, when aerodynamic understanding improved enough to help heavy sedans punch through air more efficiently, when the market once again began demanding genuine high-speed pursuit capability, the record eventually fell. It just took longer than anyone would have predicted in 1970. When the Polara was still fresh and the future seemed to promise only faster and faster machines. Here's what I want you to take away from all of this, because I think it's genuinely important beyond the horsepower numbers and the top speed figures. The 1969 Dodge Polara Pursuit was a product of a very specific moment in American automotive and regulatory history. A moment when the constraints that would define the next 3 decades hadn't fully arrived yet, when displacement still equaled performance in a relatively direct way, and when an agency with specific and uncompromising requirements could push a manufacturer to produce something genuinely extraordinary. That moment passed almost immediately after the car was built. The forces that killed it were already gathering when it ran 147 on the Chelsea banking. And the officers who drove those big Polaras through the early 1970s, watching year by year as the cars they were handed grew incrementally less powerful and less capable, watching the performance advantage that had defined their fleet evaporate in slow motion, those officers were witnessing something that has repeated itself throughout automotive history. The peak is never recognized as the peak when you're living through it. The 440 Polara didn't feel like a historical milestone in 1969. It felt like a fleet car, a tool. Something to be signed out at the beginning of a shift and parked at the end of one. And that, maybe, is the most remarkable thing about it. The fastest police car in America for 37 years was built by people who thought they were building something ordinary. Chrysler's engineers weren't trying to set a record. The California Highway Patrol wasn't trying to create a legend. They were trying to meet a specification, win a contract, and provide their officers with a tool that would let them do their job on the fastest highways in the country. The record was a byproduct of competence applied to an extreme requirement, not an attempt at immortality. 37 years. From before the first moon landing to well into the era of smartphones and hybrid vehicles. A bench seat, drum brake, carbureted four-door sedan from the Nixon administration held a performance record that the entire American automotive industry, with all its advancing technology and engineering sophistication, could not surpass. So the next time someone tells you the old cars can't compete with modern engineering, you can tell them about a 2-ton Dodge with a factory bench seat that held the police top speed record longer than most working officers today have been alive. They built them differently then, and for one specific, extraordinary, unrepeatable moment in 1969, they built them faster than anyone would manage again for a very, very long time. The Crown came from a Dodge, it outlasted everything, and when it finally passed, it went right back to a Dodge. Some legacies run in the blood.